This is Frank Islam, the President and CEO of FY Investment Group and your host of Washington Calling, where we interview leading voices from business and politics that impact you, the viewer. Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished guest who's a dear friend and very distinguished, and he is Professor Akbar Ahmed. He's a Pakistani-American academic, author, poet, playwright, filmmaker, and a former diplomat. He currently is a professor of international relations and holds the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at the American University in Washington, D.C. He also served as the Pakistani High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and Ireland. He currently is a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you, Professor Ahmed, for coming to our show, and welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Frank Islam, Honorable Frank Islam, for that very warm introduction, and delighted to be your friend for many years now, mashallah.
Yes.
And how well you are doing and contributing to the global debate.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Ahmed. You are and have been academic, Islamic scholar, civil servant, interfaith champion, author, poet, playwright, filmmaker. You have it all. So my question to you is, which was the head you enjoyed most wearing and why? And what lessons have you learned?
I think of all those long, the list of various activities of mine, and I've had the privilege of dabbling in them. I can't say anything more than that. The one that gives me the most satisfaction and gives me the most insight, particularly in the world today and the needs of the world, is poetry. Because through poetry, you understand the human heart. You understand what love is, compassion is, friendship is. And I look around the world, Mr. Frank Islam, and I see the world in great peril. I see the pandemic, which has not gone away. It keeps coming back. I see the conflicts taking place, Ukraine, Russia, the tensions in Asia. I see the communities killing and battling each other. And then above all, I see that there's this climate change which is affecting us daily. We are seeing it on our television sets, the drought, the storms, the tornadoes. And I see the indifference of man as a human society, where we don't still reach out to each other in love and embrace each other and say we must battle these existentialist threats together, not fighting each other. Mm-hmm. So I'm constantly having to fall back on poetry, which then inspires me. So I'm able to then live from day to day and feel some sense of strength and stability.
Well, poetry, and I will talk about a little bit about poetry in my on our conversation, which will be the last question that I will have. But before I do that, as we understand, the BBC has called you the world's leading authority on Islam. So the question is, do you see Islam as under threat globally? If so, why? Would you like to share with us the challenge of Islam that faces Islamic terrorism? As we all know, the Islam firmly believes in equality, dignity, tolerance, compassion, and respect for other faiths. And Islam is not a threat to the global peace, and Islam is the greatest religion of the world. So I want to get some of your thoughts on this.
You're absolutely right. I believe, as a Muslim scholar who studied Islam for decades now, it's my profession, but also my passion. I believe that Islam has a great contribution to make to world peace today, in the context of the existentialist threats that we face as a civilization. Because at the heart of Islam, and you will appreciate it as a scholar of Islam, at the heart of Islam is the understanding of God, of the divine. And that comes from the greatest names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the greatest names of his 99 names, which are enumerated in the Holy Quran, the sacred book of the Muslims. The two greatest names, which God himself points out, are Rahman and Rahim, that is compassionate, beneficent. The greatest compliment and title of the Holy Prophet of Islam is Rahmat al-Alameen, that he is a mercy unto all of mankind. So God is saying, look, the greatest title I can give to my most beloved prophet. He could have called him the conqueror and the most powerful and the most dreadful and all kinds of names that conquerors have for themselves or rulers have for themselves. No, he called him the mercy unto mankind, that he's a mercy, and he's a mercy not only for Muslims, but all of mankind. It's a beautiful, beautiful concept which embraces all of humanity. And I really feel that if Muslim scholars and Muslim activists understand on a philosophic level the significance of these words in defining Islam, I think Islam's direction, which is moving in one direction, can turn around and move in a different direction. And those dealing with Islam and some of the very prominent Western leaders and generals and politicians also need to understand that rather than see Islam as a stereotype, as an enemy to be beaten or thrown missiles and drones at, if they see this as a potential, as a dynamo, as a magnificent force for good in the world, they can help change the direction of Islam and make this a more peaceful, more harmonious world. Because that, Frank Bhai, is desperately needed. If you look at the Muslim world, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, right across the Muslim world, there is violence, there's unhappiness, there are unresolved issues. We really need to resolve those so that we live a more harmonious and more stable world.
And bring the people together for common good.
Yes.
So please tell us about your study examining relations between the West and Islamic world. What made you to write this study? And please tell us the causes of conflict and sources of tension between Islam and the West, including the clash of civilization. I also want you to shed bright lights on your thoughts on the impact of colonization.
Yes. Well,
on
these
the
are
Muslim world.
These are great questions, and you may recall when we talked 9/11, when we first met, and we had conversations and had an interview and dialogue. My concern then was the misrepresentation of Islam in the media. This is straight after 9/11. I was quite alarmed at how rapidly Islam's image was being distorted and how it was being equated to terrorism. So it became a shorthand in the media. He said Islam means terrorism, means bad guy. And I was worried because I was a teacher on campus. I was dealing with students, and many students would come up to me. And even now they come up to me, Frank Bhai, and complain. They say that we are not taught anything at school. So we come to university level with very little knowledge of Islam. So I decided, I took a very bold decision. I said, I'll take 2 or 3 of my students. I had wonderful students, very devoted. I said, look, are you prepared to travel with me? We'll go throughout the Muslim world. We'll travel, we'll go throughout the United States. And on the basis of our studies and interviews and questionnaires, we'll write up studies. So I wrote up 4 major studies over 1 decade, 4 studies, Journey into Islam. And in that I covered India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia. Then Journey into America. I traveled throughout the United States, 75 cities. I traveled for 1 year, my sabbatical. That was the year I got off, as we get on campus every 7 years. And then the next project was the Thistle and the Drone, which was looking at tribal societies living on the periphery of nations. And I was looking at the relationship between the central government and the tribe living on the periphery. And if you look at the Muslim world, Frank Bhai, think of it, from Morocco, across North Africa, Central Asia, up into the Caucasus Mountains, you'll see there's a consistent pattern of problems between the central government and the periphery. And I give the history and the reasons and the economic and political forces at play, because without resolving those issues, you will continue to have problems. And then my 4th project, again in the same context for Brookings Press, they published all these projects, was Journey into Europe, where I traveled the length and breadth of Europe, interviewed chief rabbis, archbishops, grand muftis, and wrote up this book, the study, and made a film. And I must say, I'm very grateful. These projects have been very widely discussed. Films have been seen in all kinds of film festivals and so on. So in a sense, we contributed from our point of view on the basis of scholarship to a better understanding of Islam in the West. And from these projects, my latest project, which I've just developed and I'm in the middle of, it's called The Mingling of the Oceans. And you will, as a scholar, immediately pick up the title because it is coming from your part of the world. This is the title of Prince Dara Shikoh's great work, the Majma al-Bahrain, in which he wrote this brilliant book. And remember, this is the 17th century. He's writing a book in which he's exploring the sources of Hindu religion, the Vedantas, the Upanishads, and the Quran. And he's tracing, he's not saying give up this religion for that religion. He's simply saying, how can we understand each other better? I need to understand you and you need to understand me. And that's the basis of understanding, the basis of compassion, the basis of bridge building. Brilliance.
There was a drama in American University that I attended with you.
Yes,
on the Dara Shikoh's and his reach out to the Hindu faith or any other faith, because that's
all the. And we need to revive that drama because it was about Dara Shikoh. You see, that story fascinates me, but it's the idea. I do these interfaith dialogues very often, and people are very pleased with themselves, and they say, "Yo, this is our second year of interfaith." And I tell them we were having interfaith processes, interfaith meetings, interfaith dialogues 500 years ago, and I give them examples of Akbar and Akbar the Great and Dara Shikoh, and people are shocked. And I say, we have a precedent. All we need to do is rediscover our own culture and our own civilization. So to conclude, Frank, we need to make more efforts to bring this knowledge that we have, I as a scholar, to the general public. And I'm grateful for all your support. I know that you helped us with that play. We staged it. We had a huge impact. A lot of people saw it and they really appreciated it.
And we will continue to support it through my foundation. Let me change the gear and thank you for your leadership, all you're doing. You also did a Jinnah Quartet.
Yes.
Including a film on Pakistan's founder, which is starred Christopher Lee.
Yes.
In the title role. How would the film and the book succeed? And as I understand it, the documentary was very successful, and how the documentary on Jinnah is relevant to the new generations, and how the documentary was important in terms of the fundamentals of what Jinnah said, in terms of the relations with India, and also in vision for his country with the democracy, and the full respect for women's rights, human rights, and minority rights.
Thank you very much for this question, Frank Bhai. It's very close to my heart. I spent about 10 years of my life, 10 years of my life working on what I call the Jinnah Quartet. It had a feature film with Christopher Lee in it, who, by the way, said this was the best role of his entire film career. He said this again in public. Then there was a Jinnah documentary based on all the great historians, people who knew him, people who had met him, many Indian historians, Pakistani historians, British historians. Then there was an academic book, which is still in print. It's called Jinnah, Pakistan and Islamic Identity, The Search for Salahuddin. Because my thesis was that in Muslim societies, people are constantly looking for a leader like Salahuddin. So this was the projection.
Salahuddin was the, when was he there and what was his, what were his accomplishments? So tell us a little bit about Salahuddin.
Great warrior in the middle of the Crusades. Right. Throughout, he showed his humanity. I mean, think of it. His medical advisor, his chief medical advisor was the great Rabbi Maimonides. To just think of what I've said, the greatest Muslim ruler's right-hand man who has total access to him is a rabbi. So he was that kind of a man. And when he retook Jerusalem from the Crusaders, he gave freedom to the soldiers he had captured, brought back the Jewish community who had been banned from Jerusalem, and was very, very generous. So when he died, he literally had an old Quran, which he used to read, a saddle and a sword. That's all he had, because he gave away his money to poor people, to educational institutes. He's a bit like you, he's a philanthropist. So these were the great heroes, and I explored all this in my Jinnah Quartet. And my aim was, you said the relevance, it was particularly relevant, and it is particularly relevant for young Pakistanis and young Indians, both, to understand the Jinnah story. Now, you may say, why Indians? It is crucial in India, because in India, I watch and I read the literature, and Jinnah is either distorted, because they see him as the man who broke the unity of India, or he's simply eliminated. So you don't see anything of him. And the result is very few people really know about Jinnah. They don't know that he was called the best ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. And he was called this by the head of the Congress party, Gokhale. He was called this by the second head of the Congress party, Tilak, and by Naidu, Sarojini Naidu, the great poet, who used to write love letters to him. She was so infatuated by him, not reciprocated, I may add. So he had this great impact on Indian politics. And he was one of the giants of Indian politics. But after Pakistan, he's just been dropped from Indian history. So Indians really need to reassess and relook at Jinnah. And I'll give credit to people like Advani and Vajpayee and Jaswant Singh, who wrote about Jinnah. Right. And suddenly they realized, my God, this is a giant. He's a giant of South Asia, not just Pakistan. Now, as far as Pakistanis are concerned, they must engage with him because he's the father of the nation. So his ideas about democracy, about freedom, about
minority rights,
and
women's rights,
and women's rights, and about poverty, especially the poor. Right. He's incredible. He's far ahead of his time. So I would want Pakistani leaders who often neglect these features of Jinnah to really understand him and see the vision he had for this country that he helped to create, that is Pakistan. So this project is highly relevant today, both for India and Pakistan, particularly the younger generation. So it was a mission, Frank Bhai. It was a 10-year stint. It was very hard. I ended up, my health was ruined. Financially, I was ruined. But I said, whatever happens, I will complete it. And of course, along the way, I had wonderful support, my family, my friends, people who supported me, and a lot of opposition. It's a miracle how we completed it, because I'm sorry to say this, Frank Bhai, but our people specialize in pulling you and pulling your leg. Khurram Shahzad, who's this wonderful president of Papa, we were talking about this, that our people tend to pull each other down, and rather than helping them.
That's very well said. We need to help and support each other in order to bring the people together.
Yes, exactly.
Common good. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, you had a discussion at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I serve on the board, with Ambassador Nirupa Roy, who I know very well. She's a wonderful person, on the relations between India and Pakistan on the occasion of their 75th independence anniversary. Do you see a brighter horizon for peace between India and Pakistan? And do you think India and Pakistan are ready for peace? And what can be done to bring both countries together so they can focus on improving the conditions, and also the free trade, freedom of what you call the free business relationship, the climate change, and they can talk about the pandemic, and also they can reduce the military expenditure that they have, so they can, and the conflict, so they can live in peace and harmony. Can you shed some light on it?
This is such a great question, and so important for South Asia, and I hope the leaders of both countries will listen to our discussion, because only a crazy person will say, let us, India and Pakistan, let us have a war, let us exchange nuclear weapons and try to kill each other in the maximum number, let us destroy each other. Only a crazy person will think like that, because that is not an option. It is not an option for South Asia. And the reason is, we not only share history and culture and food, and there's so many things I don't have to enumerate. And at the same time, we are distinct. We have our own religions, we have our own way of looking at the world, and we must learn to honor and respect each other. Now, what I'm seeing is, you asked the question, is it possible? I think at this moment, there's so much tension on both sides. And what worries me constantly, because I watch the media, I watch the films, I see the new films from Bollywood, the southern films from Tamil Nadu, and so on. What worries me is there's a consistent theme of a very negative portrayal of Muslims. So that constantly Muslims are being portrayed as the enemy or potential enemy or agents of Pakistan. And now the fashion has reached the point where some of the most famous Bollywood actors like Shah Rukh Khan, Amir Khan, and so on, they're being targeted, that they are Muslim and therefore they shouldn't be hired. Now, if you carry that argument to an extreme, it will negate everything that India stands for, because above all, when India emerged after independence in the late 40s, early 50s, it was a shining example to other nations who are emerging of a pluralist society, of an inclusive society. And that was the great pride of India, as far as I can understand. I was growing up in Pakistan, but we often looked at India and said, wow, they're really setting up a great example. And they're constantly trying to reach out and embrace, especially their minorities. So you had a president who was a Muslim, and you had Prime Minister Nehru setting out an example. Gandhi, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, the great man, gave his life protecting Muslims. So those were the great examples that India had given the world. And I regret to say that somehow, almost casually, Indians are now throwing that overboard. And they're creating a kind of fantasy land where they have this great vision of the past and they're going to recreate it. And in the process, and people have been saying this, very prominent Indian leaders in public, I'm not sharing any secret in public, that we will eliminate all minorities, including Muslims and Christians, by 2024, which is not too far away. So now, in the midst of this, you may say that there's no hope, and I would disagree, because in the midst of this, you have some outstanding Indians, and I salute them, who are constantly standing out and still fighting for a pluralist, inclusive India, which in a sense was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's vision. So I would hope that sooner or later, Indians rediscover that, because India is the big brother of South Asia. And if it can understand its role in influencing its neighbors, it can then begin to affect how those neighbors relate to it and how the future directions of South Asia will take place. Because we have a world where, as you very rightly said, we share together the threats of the pandemic, threats of climate change. You saw the terrible floods in Pakistan right now. These are things we share together, and we have to fight them together. So my appeal is to both Indian and Pakistani leaders to stop behaving like children fighting with each other. I throw mud at you, you throw mud at me. I compare this to that, although it's a very serious business with nuclear nations, but I really compare this to a cartoon series we used to see as children called Tom and Jerry. They're constantly fighting and trying to trip each other up. And the tragedy of that is that it's almost real. It's almost like it's happening. So you have these petty tit-for-tat situations between India and Pakistan. And I really would want to appeal to India as the bigger, more powerful, economically greater nation to try to act with more maturity and more compassion. The elder brother must reach out and in friendship and reach out his hand in compassion to the younger ones. And that will change the dynamic. And I pray and hope that that happens.
In your lifetime?
In my lifetime, because I don't know how much time I have at this stage.
That is true. We all getting older. So India needs to become a global beacon of hope for democracy and diversity. And diversity is a strength. And that's something we need to understand, that how important it is. But I want to talk a little bit about the interfaith activist and advocate, and you have been honored for your work. So was I honored for the interfaith dialogue as well. As you know, what can be done to restore trust and harmony between the major religions in South Asia? Do you believe the people of different faiths, a different creed, should be at the peace, and to bring the people together to pursue the common good?
Frank bhai, just think of South Asia. I am from South Asia, and I have great pride in being from South Asia. And I tell my American friends who are always interested in learning, it's a great country, the United States, because it has respect for learning. It's a country based in knowledge. And I tell them that you know very little about South Asia. And I point out, take Dara Shikoh, for example. Do you know that his teachers, moral teachers, were Hindu saint, Baba Lal, Hindu saint, Muslim saints. Mia Mir was one of his teachers, Mir, the great Muslim Sufi saint. Sikhs, he had very close relations with Harai, the Sikh leader. This was your tradition, that they embraced other cultures, other faiths, and learned from them and learned to live together. So I think we have so much to give. I mean, take these philosophic notions that India gives to the world, the notion of Shanti, the notion of Shama, the notion of Seva, service, Shama, Maaf Karo. These are great. And then above all, Ahimsa, non-violence. These are concepts, not modern concepts. They're coming from history. This is the Hindu side. And then take the Muslim side. You have concepts of Sulh-e-Kul, peace with all. This concept is deep deeply embedded in Islam 1,000 years ago. It's coming from Ajmer Sharif. So these are great concepts that we can share with the world, which will help the world find greater peace than it has at the moment. But this is only when we can overcome this lunatic conflict that we seem to be locked in, and we seem to have these delusions of grandeur about wiping out each other and killing each other. If we can do that, we have great spiritual strength in the land. And those are what we need to discover and rediscover. And I would urge you, as a great patron of scholarship, to promote this kind of thinking, to promote those philosophers and scholars who are promoting the relearning, rediscovery of South Asia in terms of their own concepts of peace and compassion and love.
And you were born in Allahabad, which is not too far from where I was born in Azamgarh.
Well, I was a little boy when my parents put me in a train after my birth, and we crossed in 1947. We crossed the killing fields of Punjab into Pakistan.
Right.
And my parents then, my father was posted in Karachi. He got a senior post there in the railways. And I grew up in Pakistan, and I grew up in an environment up in North Pakistan in a boarding school run by a Catholic priest. And I was very, very grateful for that, because it not only taught me English, but it gave me my love of literature. And that's why I mentioned poetry, because that's where I discovered Keats and Wordsworth and Shelley and so on. Regretfully, later I discovered Ghalib and Iqbal, because the Padris didn't encourage us reading too much Urdu and Persian.
So we want to get to your poetry and the literature. So we have a shared history and heritage. And that's an important aspect. All of us, Indians and Pakistani, we have a shared history and heritage.
Yes, and we must build on that. You see, we must.
That's very well said. We must build upon it. So as I understand, you're also a poet. When do you get the time to write the poetry, and what subject do you write? Can you elaborate on that thing, on poetry, and why poetry is important to all of us? And you write the poetry in Urdu, I hope you do.
Well, in both. Well, you see, poetry is important to me because it's a very personal expression. I write it for myself, like all poets. Poets, essentially, unless they're professional poets, I know there's not much money in it. They write for themselves, and most of the time, you're not even recognized. No one's really interested. I was surprised when the Library of Congress actually had a whole show on my poems. It's called a series called The Poet and His Poems. And I was very honored because they had a half-hour program on my poetry and broadcast it. And I just enjoyed it because I said, thank goodness someone is listening to this. But so it's basically a personal expression sometimes of a mood, sometimes a dark mood, sometimes of expression of love, of jubilation, of happiness. So there's a whole range of poems. Now, my first big poem, which will interest you, was written when I was 21 years old. I was at a university. I was in one of those students' union hot tubs. I was having a bath, and suddenly a whole poem started coming. And I jumped up, got a piece of paper, and wrote it down. And that poem was called I, Saracen. So it's like a history of Islam. Collectively, I was projecting, and I'd been discussing the Islamic history, the rise and fall, and the reasons for the rise and fall, and what we need to do as the younger generation. Remember, I was just 21. And I conclude by really saying that Muslims must now set aside the sword and pick up the quill, the pen, and fight for their own identity and their own destiny through learning and ilm and scholarship. And it reminded me of the Holy Prophet's famous hadith, his saying in which he said, the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr, which is, I think, is a great saying, especially for our younger generation.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ahmed. And this is Frank Islam wishing you a great week. And thank you for watching.